but there has been a lot of police activity today and last night here outside Nancy's home. We saw deputies roll up a couple of hours ago. They were here for about an hour, and what's interesting is they went to the back side of the house, Natasha. They opened up a cap in the ground, and they went into what we believe is a septic tank or a water tank.
The blood was already there when the first officer arrived. Not a pool, not a scene that announced itself with drama. Just a small, dark stain near the front entrance of a quiet Tucson home. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. And that is exactly what happened. In the early hours of February 2026, someone made a decision about what that stain meant. That decision, made quickly, made confidently, made without the full picture, would set the course of an investigation that would later be described as one of the most consequential failures in recent Pima County law enforcement history. But to understand how everything went wrong, the story has to go back. Back to the neighborhood, back to the woman, back to the life that existed before anyone knew it was about to end. The Catalina foothills sit at the northern edge of Tucson, Arizona, where the Sonoran Desert climbs toward the Santa Catalina Mountains. It is a quiet stretch of the city, wide roads, mature desert landscaping, homes set back from the street behind walls of stucco and stone. The kind of area where residents know their neighbors by name, where the only sounds at night are wind and the occasional coyote, and where the idea of serious crime feels distant, almost theoretical. Nancy Guthrie had lived there for years. At 84 years old, Nancy had settled into the rhythms of a life that suited her. Morning coffee with a view of the desert, evening television, weekly phone calls with her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, the NBC Today show anchor whose face millions of Americans recognized from their morning routines. But in Tucson, Nancy was not known as a celebrity's mother. She was known as a neighbor, presence, a woman whose independence was quiet and consistent. Those who lived near her described her as sharp, alert, someone who noticed things. A car parked where it had not been before, a gate left open that was usually closed. She had spent enough years in that house to know the difference between ordinary and out of place. And that matters, because what happened to Nancy Guthrie was not the result of confusion or misfortune. Investigators would later conclude that what happened to her was the result of planning. But none of that was known on the morning her absence was first reported. What was known, or what should have been known, was that something at that house was not right. The stain near the entrance, the silence inside, the phone that went unanswered. These were not ambiguous details. Taken together, they formed a picture that pointed in a specific direction. But the picture was not read that way. Not at first. The initial framing of the situation, the working assumption that shaped the first hours of the response, was that an elderly woman may have wandered away from her home. That assumption had consequences. Hi viewers, when you see a story like this one, where an assumption made in the first few hours changes everything that follows, it makes you think. Have you ever witnessed a situation where the wrong conclusion was reached too quickly? Let us know in the comments below.
Also last night, they were at Annie Guthrie's home, as you mentioned. This came as a surprise. I raced over there. They were there for 3 hours. We saw 3 deputies get out of a car. They went into the house, and they were doing some kind of evidence processing, taking pictures inside the house.
The hours immediately following a disappearance or a scene like the one at Nancy Guthrie's home are referred to by investigators as the critical window. It is the period when evidence is most intact, when memory is freshest, when the physical environment still holds the answers that time and exposure will begin to erode. In high-stakes cases, every decision made during that window carries weight. And during the critical window at Nancy Guthrie's home, the scene was not treated as a potential crime scene with the full urgency that the physical evidence warranted. Access was not restricted the way it should have been. The area was not secured with the protocol typically applied when the evidence suggests something more serious than a missing person. People moved through the space. Time passed, and with that time, the fragile integrity of what had happened inside and outside that home began to quietly deteriorate. The family was not immediately satisfied with the response. Savannah Guthrie, thousands of miles away in New York, learned that her mother was missing and began pressing for answers. What she got in those early hours was the working theory, the wandering explanation, and the assurance that the situation was being handled. But the situation was not being handled with the weight it deserved. It would take days before the framing began to shift. A doorbell camera in the vicinity of the home captured something. The footage was brief, seconds, not minutes, but what it showed was not consistent with the story that had been forming around Nancy's disappearance.
I met up with a former Border Patrol agent who knows this area so well. Look at what he showed me.
You'll see this is kind of like a trail where you know which way to walk in there.
Everything is like got thorns too, huh?
Everything's got thorns. And I think the difference is people hear desert landscape and they almost think that it's nothing but sand and you could see mud.
The last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie was not dramatic. There was no argument, no visible distress, no moment that anyone who witnessed it would later describe as alarming. She had been seen in the days leading up to her disappearance going about the kind of routine that had defined her life in Tucson for years. Errands, home, the phone call with her daughter, the quiet that followed. And then, at some point in the early days of February 2026, that routine stopped. It was the phone that raised the first alarm. Nancy was consistent with her calls, consistent enough that when one did not come, and then another, the absence registered. When Savannah Guthrie could not reach her mother, and when attempts to check on her through local contacts produced no answer at the door, the concern escalated quickly. A welfare check was requested. And when someone finally made it to that home in the Catalina foothills and stood at the front entrance, what they found was not a woman who had stepped out and forgotten to call. What they found was a home that looked, in most ways, like a home where someone still lived. Personal items in place. No visible signs of anything overturned or clearly disturbed at first inspection. Nothing that immediately announced itself as the scene of something serious, except the stain near the entrance. That detail, that single physical fact sitting at the threshold of the home, should have reframed everything that followed. It did not. The stain was noted. It was not immediately treated as the kind of evidence that changes the nature of a response. And so the response that followed was built on a foundation that did not account for what the evidence was already pointing toward. The working theory that Nancy may have left on her own, that she may have become disoriented, that this was a missing elderly person situation rather than something more serious, began to shape decisions. Resources were directed accordingly. The scene was approached with the urgency of a welfare concern, not the precision required for a potential crime scene. Hours passed. People moved through and around the property. The door was opened and closed. The area was not restricted with the kind of perimeter that preserves the physical record of what occurred. And while that was happening, the window that investigators would later identify as most critical was quietly closing. By the time the framing began to shift, by the time the evidence started pushing back against the initial assumption, that window had not just narrowed, it had shut. What forced the shift was the footage. A residential security camera positioned near the property had captured something during the relevant time frame. The footage was not high resolution. It was not long, but what it showed could not be reconciled with the theory that Nancy had simply walked away. A figure, moving along the edge of the property, not running, not appearing startled or reactive, moving with the kind of deliberateness that does not come from improvisation. When investigators analyzed the footage more carefully, what stood out was not just the movement. It was the timing. The figure appeared during a window that aligned with what the evidence inside the home suggested about when Nancy was last present. And the behavior captured in those seconds, the awareness of camera angles, the pace, the direction, pointed toward someone who had thought about this in advance. That footage did not close the case, but it closed the theory. Nancy Guthrie had not wandered away. Something had happened at that house. Someone had been there, and that someone had not arrived without a plan. When investigators began to reconstruct what they believed had happened, they were working backward from fragments. The footage, the physical evidence at the scene, the digital trail that had been identified in the weeks prior, and the forensic material that was collected from inside the home. Material that, rather than providing a clear path forward, introduced a new layer of complexity. The DNA recovered from the property was sent for analysis. The results came back with a finding that complicated everything. The sample was mixed. In forensic terms, a mixed DNA profile means that the genetic material collected at a scene contains contributions from more than one individual. It is not uncommon. It does not automatically mean contamination. But it does mean that isolating a single profile, identifying one contributor with the kind of certainty that moves an investigation forward, becomes significantly harder. In some cases, it becomes impossible without additional reference samples to compare against. The mixed profile that came back from Nancy Guthrie's home did not immediately identify anyone. It raised the number of possible contributors. It required additional analysis. And it meant that the forensic thread investigators had hoped would accelerate the case instead placed it in a holding pattern while laboratory work continued. That delay mattered, because the public timeline was already moving. The case had attracted national attention not just because of its circumstances, but because of who Nancy Guthrie's daughter was.
Well, so this is basically the brush. And as you walk further in, these are called, this is the actual wash. These are the washes. We haven't walked too far, but if you go this way, and here I will show you, if it's dark out here, or even now, vehicles can go through this neighborhood and they're not going to see anybody in this area.
Savannah Guthrie's public profile meant that the disappearance of her mother carried visibility that most missing person cases never receive. News coverage was extensive. Questions were being asked loudly and publicly about what had happened and how the investigation was being handled. And some of those questions were directed not just at the case itself, but at the decisions made in its earliest hours. Journalists covering the story, including investigative reporter Brian Entin, whose reporting brought specific procedural questions into public focus, began to document a pattern of concerns. Why had the scene not been secured with greater urgency given the physical evidence present? Why had the initial assumption pushed the response in a direction that did not match what the evidence suggested? Who made those calls and on what basis? Those questions produced friction. Law enforcement agencies are not structured to absorb that kind of scrutiny easily, particularly when the scrutiny is accurate. And in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the scrutiny was pointing at real gaps. One of the more significant concerns raised involved the leadership of the relevant investigative unit. Reports emerged suggesting that the individual overseeing aspects of the case had professional history that raised questions about judgment and credibility. The details were specific enough that they could not be dismissed as speculation, and they added another dimension to the already complicated picture of how this investigation had been conducted. The pattern that emerged from the behavior analysis of the footage, the digital search records, and the physical evidence at the scene pointed in a consistent direction. This had not been a random encounter. Whoever had targeted Nancy Guthrie's home had done so with awareness of her routines, her property, and the timing that would give them the best window to act without being interrupted. That level of planning implied something about the relationship between the responsible party and the target. Not necessarily a personal relationship in the conventional sense, but familiarity, knowledge, the kind of detailed awareness that does not come from a single casual observation. Whether that awareness came from direct contact, from surveillance conducted over time, or from information obtained through other means was still being worked through. But the conclusion that this was targeted had become the foundation of the investigation, replacing the original assumption entirely. The difficulty was that a targeted crime requires a motive, and identifying a motive requires understanding the connection. And without Nancy, without the ability to ask her what she knew, what she had noticed, whether anything had felt wrong in the weeks before, investigators were constructing that understanding entirely from the outside. That is one of the most difficult positions for an investigation to be in, and it was exactly where this one found itself. As weeks moved into months, the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance did not slow, but it also did not break open in the way that investigators and the public had hoped. Instead, it continued to produce new details that added weight to what was already known, without delivering the one thing everyone was waiting for: a confirmed identification, a location, an answer, the digital evidence that had been gathered, the search records tracing back through the weeks before February, the pattern of focused, specific online activity targeting Nancy's property, was being worked through carefully. Investigators were attempting to trace the origin points of those searches, to identify the devices involved, to follow the chain backward toward a person or persons who could be placed at the center of the activity. That process is painstaking. It moves through legal channels. It requires cooperation between agencies and, in some cases, between jurisdictions. And it does not always produce results on the timeline that urgency demands. At the same time, the forensic work on the DNA evidence continued. Additional reference samples had been submitted. Analysts were working to separate the contributors within the mixed profile and to find points of comparison that might narrow the field. It was detailed, careful, time-consuming work, exactly the kind of work that does not translate well into public updates, because the nature of it is incremental rather than conclusive. Meanwhile, external pressure on the case continued to build. The involvement of federal law enforcement, specifically the FBI, had been confirmed. That confirmation carried meaning beyond the investigative resource it represented. Federal involvement in a case typically signals one of two things. Either the complexity or scale of the situation has exceeded what local or county agencies can manage alone, or the case has crossed into territory, geographic, legal, or otherwise, that triggers federal jurisdiction. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, both applied. The geographic scope of the digital trail extended beyond Pima County, and the questions around how the case had been handled in its earliest hours had reached a level of visibility that required a response from entities beyond local law enforcement. Savannah Guthrie had not retreated from public view during this period. Her presence in the national media, the very platform that gave her visibility, became a factor in how the case was reported and how pressure was maintained on the institutions responsible for finding answers. There is a reality in investigations like this one. The more public attention a case holds, the harder it becomes for agencies to quietly manage the narrative. That attention had served, in this instance, as a form of accountability. It had also served to keep the name Nancy Guthrie in front of an audience that might otherwise have moved on. But accountability and answers are not the same thing. And as the investigation moved through its second and third month, the family was still waiting for the answer that mattered most. Where was Nancy? That question, straightforward in its form, devastating in its weight, remained without a definitive public response. Law enforcement confirmed the investigation was active. They confirmed that leads were being pursued. They confirmed that the case had been reclassified in a way that reflected the evidence rather than the original assumption. But they did not confirm a location. They did not confirm what had happened to an 84-year-old woman in her own home in a neighborhood where the gates were supposed to keep the wrong people out. And that silence, institutional, procedural, perhaps necessary, landed differently on the family than it did on the agencies producing it. There was also a broader dimension to what the case had exposed. The vulnerability of elderly individuals living alone, even in areas perceived as secure, had become a quiet theme in coverage of the story. The idea that someone could research a private home, identify a resident, observe patterns of behavior, and act on that research without triggering any alert in the systems designed to protect people, that idea had moved beyond the specifics of one case in Tucson. It had become a question about something larger, something about what protection actually means, and who it actually reaches. As of the most recent verified reporting on this case, Nancy Guthrie had not been located. The investigation remained active and ongoing. No arrests had been publicly announced. No individual had been formally identified by law enforcement as responsible for what happened at that home in February 2026. What had been established through the combined record of physical evidence, digital forensics, security footage, and investigative reporting was that Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not accidental. It was not the result of confusion or a medical event that led her away from home without telling anyone. It was the result of a deliberate act carried out by someone who had spent time preparing for it and executed in a way that revealed awareness and control. That finding, while it did not produce immediate answers, was not nothing. It closed a false path. It redirected resources. And it placed the case in its correct category, one that demanded a different level of attention than the one it had initially received. The cost of that correction, however, had been time. And in investigations, time is the one resource that cannot be recovered. The forensic material was still being processed. The digital trail was still being traced. The federal investigation was continuing in parallel with local efforts. Each thread was being worked, but threads take time to follow, and the person at the other end of each thread had not made themselves easy to find. Nancy Guthrie's family had gone through what families in these situations are required to go through. Not just the weight of uncertainty about someone they loved, but the additional burden of watching the systems designed to help them move slowly through procedures that felt inadequate to the moment. That burden does not resolve when an investigation remains open. It accumulates. The reporters who had covered this case most closely had noted something worth holding on to. The initial assumption, the one made in the earliest hours, the one that shaped the response, the one that cost the investigation time it could not get back, had not been made out of malice. It had been made out of habit. The pattern recognition that leads professionals to reach for the most familiar explanation when something unfamiliar sits in front of them. The wandering elderly person, the disoriented resident, the explanation that fits a known category and requires less immediate action than the alternative. It is a pattern that has appeared in other cases. It will appear again, and the lesson it points toward is not comfortable, because it suggests that the failure was not isolated, not the result of one bad decision by one individual on one morning. It was systemic, built into the way assumptions get made and the speed at which they get questioned. Nancy Guthrie deserved better than that. She deserved a response that matched the evidence from the first hour, not the third day. She deserved the full weight of what the systems around her were capable of, deployed from the moment it was clear something was wrong. Whether that weight can now produce the answers her family is waiting for is a question this investigation is still working to answer. The stain near the entrance was still the first detail, still the piece of evidence that sat at the beginning of everything. And in the accounting of what this case has meant, to the investigation, to the public conversation about how elderly individuals are protected, to the ongoing questions about institutional response, that detail remains the one that started it all. Seen, assessed, initially explained away, until it couldn't be anymore. If this case made you stop and think, you are not alone. Stories like Nancy Guthrie's matter, not just as investigations, but as reminders of what happens when systems fall short and families are left carrying the weight of that gap. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters here. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to this channel with notifications on, because the next story is one you will not want to miss.